Welcome to Music Crush, a new music podcast hosted by the Flute New Music Consortium. I'm Nicole Reiner.
And I'm Elizabeth Robinson.
If you like the show, please rate and review it on the platforms wherever you listen to podcasts, particularly on Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find us and grow the show. And of course, you can learn more about Flute New Music Consortium at flutenewmusicconsortium.com.
Acclaimed for performing repertoire ranging from orchestral literature to electronic music, flutist, composer, and educator Dr. Melissa Keeling is based in Bowling Green, Kentucky. Her music has been described as revelatory by the Flutist Quarterly, the most creative flute writing of 2018 next to Bjork, a delight, stunning, and moving by the Flute View. Melissa is a Trevor James International Flute Artist and an endorsed artist by K&K Sound. Her solo albums, Sonic, Supersonic, and the Quarantine Tapes feature original music for flute with effects pedals. She has also published 2 books, The Electric Flute, A Beginner's Guide to Playing Flute with Effects, and The Glissando Flute, Handbook for Composers and Performers, which is the first method book for glissando headjoint ever published.
Well, thanks for joining us today, Melissa.
Thank you so much for having me.
You moved from the middle of the country to New York City to pursue a doctorate. Can you tell us what that was like for you?
Well, that was huge, as anyone can imagine, I guess. So it's that classic story, I think, of country girl moves to the city to try the music thing. Honestly, what I really wanted was to study with Robert Dick, and one of my heroes anyway, and I couldn't believe that he had room in his studio. And when he said, yeah, sure, come study with me, I was like, well, where do you teach? And I'll just apply to those schools. And it happened to be in New York, of course, so that was where I went. What I learned wasn't what I thought I was going to learn from that experience, which I think is the beautiful thing. My biggest takeaway of getting a doctorate was honestly that I know nothing. When I realized that, I felt like I got the message of what a doctorate's all about. How little I really know. But really what I learned the most from that was more about a toughness in my personality, just from surviving, financially surviving, musically surviving, needing to stick up for myself creatively in a way that I wasn't expecting. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger kind of thing. The Schenkerian analysis classes were less of an impact on me than just trying to make it in that kind of situation.
Would you recommend it? I mean, and not necessarily New York, but just, any moving to any situation. I mean, you're teaching in Kentucky now. If you had a very ambitious student in the near future, you will, I'm sure you do now. Would you recommend kind of throwing yourself into the lion's den?
Depends on your personality, but I mean, absolutely. I think of myself as a very determined person. And nothing was going to change my mind on what I really wanted to do. For me, the New York part was like I say, kind of a coincidence of wanting to study with a particular teacher. But if you have that in your heart to move to New York or to study with so-and-so or move across the country, a lot of times, I mean, you got to follow that instinct. And while I regret maybe my student loan debt, I don't regret that experience, which is truly priceless and gave me that like armor that I was lacking, and I wasn't really aware of that, how much I needed that. And I think to be a creative person in the year 2023 and beyond, that like just, I guess it's more than toughness. It's like a resilience or like a self-belief, not needing that validation from a professor or even really needing that piece of paper that says I have the degree, but just that belief in myself that I have what it takes or I'll figure it out. And so I think there's a lot to learn beyond just the courses that you take while you're there.
I'm really interested in your experience as a person in New York City. I didn't say this before we started the interview, but I grew up down the road from you in Tennessee. And I did a graduate degree in a very different major metropolitan area, but dumped myself in the middle of San Francisco. And I feel like that sort of culture shift was so formative to me. I get a little excited when I see other Southerners, especially in the music field. Would you mind talking a little bit about sort of the transition or the change?
Sure. I mean, I could talk about this so much, so I'm just trying not to go in the wrong direction here. But yes, so and I love that story too. So I feel the same way that you do when you shared that with me. Moving there, personally, I had just gotten married, but my husband and I were living in different states because I was finishing my master's in Tennessee. So moving to New York was the first time that we were married and living together. And we were like,
Oh,
well, let's sell everything we have and pack up the Toyota Camry, and did not have an apartment, did not have a job. All I knew was that classes started on whatever, September 1st. We ended up finding an apartment in Manhattan, a neighborhood called Washington Heights, which at the time was and still is a very Hispanic, Puerto Rican, Dominican neighborhood. The great people. One day I was going to class and I dropped my wallet on the street accidentally. And someone was like, hey, a guy that I knew on the street, you dropped your wallet. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's nothing in there. But wow, like you might not expect that in New York. I finally felt leaving the South and now being in such an open minded city as New York is. I'm sure San Francisco, you can feel the same way about that. That I could be as crazy as I wanted to be and like let my weirdness, like that's not a bad thing, but all of my idiosyncrasies were accepted because everyone there has their own beautiful, amazing story, and everyone's so different. I got dreadlocks. That was a thing. Like I had always wanted to do that. Now to have dreadlocks in the South, that might.
Yeah.
I wasn't ready to deal with that kind of attention.
Uh-huh.
But in New York, everyone's like, "Oh, she's got dreadlocks. That's fine." Not everyone. I had certainly had more than one negative run-in with someone who did not like the dreadlocks, and that's part of the experience that made me strong, was to be able to not totally have a panic attack if someone confronted me about something like that. And then I guess musically, how do you get a gig in a place like that?
yeah, that was a big learning curve for me. Was that weird for you too?
I think moving anywhere, it takes at least a few years to really establish yourself. And it's all who you know. And I knew no one except really my classmates. And this is at the City University of New York, the Graduate Center, which is a very small program. There were 12 of us in my class. I think I was the only flutist. Definitely an outsider, and it wasn't easy. I was a Southerner. I was young. I was 24, a woman.
Oh yeah.
I went to state schools. I
Mm-hmm.
had a music education degree. All of these are seen as not part of the in crowd,
Sure.
at least in the culture where I was there at CUNY, where my classmates had gone to Juilliard or Mannes and had outstanding performance backgrounds. So I really felt like I had to kind of like prove myself in a way. I'm sure everyone feels that way a bit. A lot of making a path there was establishing relationships with as many people as possible, and authentic ones too, not just like, hey, I want work, but like real authentic relationships, like Thanksgiving dinner with people. So, and that doesn't happen overnight. I'm really introverted, so to
Sure.
even have that kind of like personality where I put myself out there, that was a huge growth for me. Even just riding the subway
Oh
is
gosh,
totally
yeah.
foreign. Listened to a lot of awesome music, read a lot of great books on those subways. Very physically demanding. So just like got in shape in every way possible.
Yeah, I remember the first probably month I lived in San Francisco, my legs were sore all of the time, and I could never figure out why. And I realized later it was because I was walking like miles a day just to and from the San Francisco train system is the Muni. Just the walk to and from the train, and then from the train to wherever I was going was like a wildly different thing than where I had grown up. I'm gonna ask one more like fish out of water question, just because this is a topic that I really do get too excited about. Culturally, for me, I went from being everybody's weird hippie friend and the girl that was maybe a little too into music to being everybody's conservative friend. And it sounds like similar to you, mostly state schools and less of an illustrious performance pedigree. What was that like for you? Did you notice it? Did you have a similar experience at all?
Yeah, so I guess my hippie persona really flourished in New York, where I started reading all kinds of like beat literature and listening to the Grateful Dead. Yeah, so I maybe some parts of that colorful hippie-esque, like you say, personality that I might have not felt was okay to show in a place like Southern Kentucky. Now I don't, now I'm fine with it. I'll do it here. It's fine now. I learned that from New York, but all of a sudden I just felt so just free. I don't know a better word for that. Just whatever direction that I felt drawn in, it felt accepted by at least somebody. That's the beauty of a place like New York. You can find your tribe. People will hopefully understand you no matter what kind of color or stripe you have or are. But yeah, of course I was the Southerner. That was very different. There weren't Southerners around me. And even just like some words I would say, people would start laughing because I would say them wrong.
What was your first one?
Oh, the one that I remember the most was Manhattan.
Oh
I
no.
think I was Manhattan. I don't know if I have a country accent. When I was a little girl, I saw people would judge my mother, who has a very thick Southern accent. Amazing woman, my mother. But even in kindergarten, I remember thinking, oh, I should try not to sound country because people will find me or think that I am uneducated. And I certainly ran into that in New York. A lot of like people hear me talk and then expect me to be ignorant, which is very frustrating. And I felt really shy about that at first. And then about halfway through the DMA program or whatever, I kind of like switched gears on that and was like, you know what? No, this isn't like, I shouldn't need to hide this, like who I am. There's nothing wrong with being from the South, being young, being a woman, going to state schools. I can hold my own against these people. And so what if if I say words wrong, like, I don't know, they're saying them wrong to me. So you just gotta learn how to have a sense of humor and a bit of it's not like you don't care, but at least for me, I was caring a lot about how I was being perceived. So as long as I feel true to myself, this is, I guess, a kind of a theme for my music too. That's what makes me feel grounded and happy.
You moved to New York for Robert Dick. Tell us about Robert Dick.
Oh my gosh, yes. Okay. My first experience with Robert Dick, he came to Bowling Green, Kentucky, which is where I live now. I was taking flute lessons and I was in high school. I didn't know who he was. This is before the internet.
Oh, yeah.
If everyone can remember these days. Some of us can't. My flute teacher was like, oh, well, there's an event happening Saturday. This guy named Robert's coming to town. You should go. And I was like, well, there's nothing else going on in this town. So I went. I had no idea what to expect. And wow, I was like totally, like I had no clue that this kind of thing existed. Had no concept of contemporary music at all. I was probably like 16. I clearly remember he was playing one of his pieces titled Flames Must Not Encircle Sides, which there's about 4 breaths in the 8-minute long piece because it's based on circular breathing and multiphonics, timbral trills. It's gorgeous. If anyone hasn't heard it, highly recommend. It was one of the weirdest magical moments of my life, and I've only had a few of these. It was like the metaphorical sparkles came down from the sky, and I was like, this is what I'm gonna do. This is it. I want to make my own music. And kind of like I don't want, like, that song's cool, but the way that he was clearly expressing himself so personally, it's his voice in such a clear way and so unique. I didn't really know what that meant at that time. I definitely knew that I had a moment where I just kind of, like a moment of destiny. I know that sounds super cliche, but it happened. So anyway, fast forward some time, I had written an album, attempted to write an album, and I sent it to him. Dear Mr. Robert, I humbly would like you to listen to my album. Your music has had a huge impact on my career. Do you have room in your studio? So the fact that he even responded to that email, like, I was like, oh my gosh, it's like John Travolta or something. I was like, that was huge to me. And then, so he said yes. I met him at some NFA conventions, and we had some like one-on-ones and some talks. And the fact that I even got into CUNY is kind of a miracle to me. So studying with him, I thought, if there's anyone that can help me on my quest of writing this creative, expression, and for me, it's with electronics. If anyone can help me with this, surely it's him. I'm sure there's other professors or teachers I could have studied with, but that's how I felt at the time. Studying with him, I was getting a performance degree, and it was a bit of the balance of me wanting to get into creative work with him was a little stilted in favor of working on classical repertoire that the program was requiring me to do. I have so many fabulous stories. I'll try to think of a few that succinctly can sum up an experience of studying with Robert. One semester, he had lessons in his home, most usually. One semester, he had his coffee table covered in jaw harps. There was probably 30 or 40 jaw harps on the coffee table for weeks. Not just like one lesson I show up, for weeks. I don't know, like a month into the semester, I was like, what's up with the jaw harps, man? And it was like he was waiting for this moment. And he picks one up and he plays this like super virtuosic thing on the jaw harp. And I was like, well, rad. That's what's up. So he actually asked if I would like one of these jaw harps that he had on the table. Absolutely. You always say yes to a question like that, right? Of course, the question is like, why? Why are there 40 jaw harps on the table? Of course, he was personally into it. It wasn't like a pedagogical thing that he was necessarily bringing up to anyone unless they asked, which I think is a really important lesson that he did want to teach, was to encourage students to ask why. So why, right? Why, Robert? I mean, of course it's fun. It's a really fun instrument. I had never really played one, but he was explaining how helpful it was in his multiphonic practice to be able to have finer control of what's happening inside your mouth. To be able to make different sounds on the jaw harp, you got to change your mouth in all sorts of funny ways. And it's very evident when you play a jaw harp if you're making that change. Whereas on the flute, it's not always so clear what change you need to make physically to make a certain sound. Maybe what was more surprising to him was that I learned the first track on the jaw harp CD and played it for him at my next lesson. So I still have that jaw harp, and I thought that was a really brilliant teaching moment. Very not traditional, but such as Robert Dick. I love rock and roll. He really loves rock and roll, so we really shared that. And I remember one time he was talking to me about articulation. He puts on a Steve Vai guitar CD. I don't know if anyone knows Steve Vai. I didn't know Steve Vai at the time. And he was like, well, listen to this. And he puts on this guitar track. And he was like, well, if he wasn't articulating that, it would lose its power. And I was like, well, yes, but also, can I get this CD? Because I'd never heard this before, and this is kind of changing my life right now. So he would have these really creative ways of teaching that were really different from how my previous teachers had taught. Not always about just the flute, but just music. We had lessons on orchestral excerpts and classical etudes, and that wasn't really what I had expected when I would envision taking a Robert Dick, a lesson with Robert. But he had some really brilliant things to say about all kinds of repertoire, not just the contemporary things. One of the most impactful things that he ever said to me, it was my very last lesson. I was leaving, and I had just purchased a glissando headjoint from him. Very excited about this. I was working on an arrangement of a Van Halen tune called Eruption at the time, and he had helped me a little bit with this arrangement. So as I was leaving, I was like kind of just throwing about how I was going to continue to work on this Van Halen idea, and maybe I could find some cool flute repertoire to use this glissando headjoint for. This is like, I'm literally like the doors closing. It's like, bye. And he was like, well, if the kind of music that you want to hear isn't out there, then you should write it yourself. As maybe obvious as that sounds, that was a huge, I don't know if it was like permission or just that clear statement that just felt so obvious. I was very much just looking at what was already out there instead of looking within and saying, well, you know what? I think I might have some ideas for that myself. So that was just a really beautiful moment and a piece of advice that he shared with me.
I wanted to ask you about the glissando head joint, and I now suspect I think I know what the answer is going to be, but I was curious because I noticed so many of his current and former students are the ones I see publicly, performing on the glissando head joint, like yourself. Was that an expectation in his studio, or did he just wait for you to ask, a la jaw harp curiosity?
Yeah, so I'm interesting that you feel that you know the answer to that, and I would suspect that you're right. No, there was no expectation for anything with Robert, and I feel that part of what I wanted to learn and the way that he teaches is for you to discover what you want. What do you want? Like creatively, musically, professionally, instead of like saying, do this, play this, like this. It wasn't that way at all. Even when I was working on his music with him, there would be phrases and he's like, well, that's not exactly what I meant with what I wrote there. And I'm like, oh no. I'm like, well, can you play it for me? Maybe I'm just like not understanding, what you intended through your notation. But if you play it, then I'll totally understand. He would not play it for me. And it would make me so frustrated. And he was like, no, you play it your way. I liked your way. And I was like, well, but I just do want to know how you would intend that to be. And he was like, well, that doesn't matter. And I just thought that was frustrating but I was like transitioning into a professional musician here.
Yeah.
And I needed to not rely on that follow me attitude and instead follow yourself. And you're hearing this a certain way. And that's how Melissa plays this. I needed to know that was okay too. So I guess to answer your glissando head joint question directly, yeah, no, it's there for anyone that's interested. I think something that is very cool about the people that study with Robert, I feel like a kinship with anyone that says that they've studied with Robert. It's almost like a tribe. The type of person or flutist that would be interested to study with him or learn from him, many of them have these very creative ideas that are very different from other students of his or even from his own work. So there's like a lot of curiosity around that. But yeah, no, it wasn't like you're studying with me, now you're going to learn this head joint. And in fact, it was quite the opposite. When I got my head joint, he was like, okay, well, it works like this. And here, is there more? And he's like, we'll figure it out. You'll figure it out. I learned a lot from that kind of attitude.
Speaking of cracking open that glissando head joint box, the long answer, of course, is buy the book. Short answer, though, for people listening today who are glissando head joint curious, do you have any little tidbits of advice for newbies to get acquainted with their new head joints?
I like your short answer or your long answer. Get the book.
Yeah.
It is such a wonderful ear training tool, honestly.
Yeah. Sure.
And even across other musical traditions that use bending more extensively, which is really where I went first. I mean, we have bending in flute music, but I love rock and roll. He loves rock and roll, and particularly Jimi Hendrix. So he didn't necessarily create the head joint to play rock and roll, but knowing that he came from that as being a source of inspiration, the guitar plays all kinds of bends and slides. So Robert and I have that in common. But I mean, even looking at other instruments, vocalists, portamento is such a key part of singing. And you don't even think about it. It's natural. I can sing. You don't want to hear me sing. It's very basic. But even for someone at my vocal level, if I'm singing Amazing Grace, there's bends in there. I don't think about where to bend when I sing. It happens. Actually, I have to think to not bend when I sing. So to have an awareness of where do you bend? That was really the big question. Where do you put these bends? if you do it too much, it almost becomes like a bit of a circus, slidey whistle,
Yeah.
magic, like a one-trick pony thing. But
Mhm.
I think the subtlety of it is really what makes it so powerful. To be able to take a melody and to make it sound more vocal implies the use of portamento. So I spent a lot of time, and I might advise to others as well, to listen really closely to not just flute music, and actually maybe not flute music, but violin music, singers like Frank Sinatra. I'm not talking, I mean, classical singers too, sure, but especially popular singers, even like jazz trombone or jazz trumpet. There's so many instruments where bends are a natural part. And it's very exciting as a flutist to be able to be part of that tradition, which is really new to our instrument in many ways. There's world flute traditions that use bends enormously. So it's really just the silver flute that's a little behind the game. We need to catch up. So
Yeah.
it's a bit of getting away from the page and tuning into music and what you are hearing and developing your ear with that. Honestly, it's not so tricky once you like play around with it for a week or two. It's you bend down, you bend back up, you slide the thing in, you slide the thing out. So the big question is, how do you use that musically? And that's where the journey lies.
Yeah. That sounds wonderfully freeing, actually. That's a great perspective. Your other book is called The Electric Flute, A Beginner's Guide to Playing Flute with Effects. Both of these books will be in the show notes, by the way. Why should flutists explore this type of playing?
Because it's fun. That's my first answer. And you know what's funny is I think I kind of joke around that the word fun is kind of like a curse word in academia or
Mm.
classical flute playing. I call it the F word. I know, I just said the F word. But to me, without electronics, I don't think I'd be playing the flute today. I think I would have gone a different direction, and maybe others might feel the same way. I'm not saying it's for everyone. This is the 21st century, and to exclude electronics, I think, is a little bit of limiting or holding ourselves back. Now, can you use electronics in it's again like the glissando headjoint? Yeah, you can make it like a circus or just sound like, oh, I'm just using it for special effects.
Mhm.
But for me, the way I approach it is, how can I expand the possibilities as a flutist? It's not to cover up anything. Honestly, it amplifies every mistake or deficiency in your playing. No pun intended, but yeah, it literally amplifies it. So instead, it's like, okay, the flute does some things really well. Like we play melodies, gorgeous melodies. We have, some great tone color possibilities. We can play really fast, right? So once you start thinking about the strengths of our instrument, it's like, okay, that's great. But there's a lot of weaknesses too, like low notes. What about a bass line? What about doing something other than monophonic playing? And sure, we have multiphonics, which I think are fabulous. And this isn't to replace multiphonics, but you can get entire chords going on with electronics. You can have an accompaniment part that you record with yourself. You can use things like delay and reverb to give like a fatness to your sound because the flute might be a little thin. To me, the electronics are not an afterthought. It's not something like, oh, well, I worked on this piece and now I'm going to put the effects on later. It's my instrument. It's part of my instrument. And to play without it, I mean, I'm playing acoustic flute, as I call it. And that's fine. I spent a lot of time playing acoustic flute. And you got to have technique. You got to have the beautiful tone, and all that has to be in place. So for me, it's an extension. It's a growth of the instrument, and it seems like a natural one and perhaps an overdue one. These effects have been around for a really long time, and I think it's time. I think it's time. It's opened so many doors for me artistically at a time when I was feeling so burned out musically, and I felt directionless creatively. I didn't know how to express myself, going back to that first story about I heard Robert when I was 16 and thought I would like to make something that's a creative expression through effects. And only because of playing with electronics and effects pedals did I then say, oh, I can arrange something. Oh, I'm going to have to improvise something. There's no music for this. I guess I'll have to write something for this. So I kind of came into composing backwards through that door, but all that to say, I'm positive that there are other flutists out there who have experienced those kinds of things and find electronics interesting. I wish there had been a book for me when I first started, because it was a decade of many failed experiments. So I hope the book is a resource for anyone that, like me, might be interested in doing something creatively through effects pedals.
I'm really interested in your book. I learned about it in preparation for the show, and I'm super excited actually to share it with a couple of my current and former students who I think are going to have some light bulbs go off when they have a resource that can be in the same place as them to learn. You've queued up what we were going to ask next so perfectly. I almost feel cheesy asking it. Can you talk a little bit about ways you developed your interest in electronics? You mentioned some trial and error, so I take it in whatever direction makes sense to you.
Well, thank you for that. That means a lot. Seriously, what had happened was I was finishing my music education degree as an undergrad. It was like April. And it was like the what next moment. And I wasn't sure. I could go and get a job teaching elementary school and, make a living. And honestly, I did spend many years teaching elementary school full time. Fabulous way to make a living. But at that time, I wasn't quite ready for that. But I didn't know. I was like, well, I was putting a lot of time into this practicing thing. And some of my friendships had really suffered from like the competition that comes out of the music world, which I don't think is right. I'm very unhealthy, or it was for me. Like I said, I just felt like I didn't know what my place was as a performer. This is Kentucky as well. There's not like a ton of orchestras around here. So I went over, as I did after school, to my boyfriend's house. We're married now. He's my husband. He was a guitar major at the university where I was finishing my degree as well, where we met. Anyway, so I walk in and he was practicing electric guitar. And I'm going to say another bad word here, but he was having so much fun playing his instrument. And I was like, well, that's what I want. It's supposed to be fun. They call it playing the flute. They don't say work the flute, but it had felt like so much work for me. And I was like, so tempted to just like let it all go. It's a lot of commitment. So I had hope. I was like, look, he's having fun. Now, looking back, I realized maybe I'm just really interested in the guitar. For whatever reason, I looked down and he was playing with stomp boxes, some effects pedals, and I thought, well, that's got to be the reason why he's having so much fun, those stomp boxes. I was like, well, Michael, can I play with those stomp boxes? Like, is that even a thing that people do? Is that electrically possible? And he was like, well, I guess so. You just need a microphone. And I didn't know other people that was doing this with the flute, although there were. But again, this is like early internet days, and I was young, so I had a lot to learn. And there was no electric flute book, by the way. So finally, we got a microphone, I don't know, from somewhere. And I kind of hijacked his effects pedals. And there was a guitar amp, which is not the best for the flute, but it works, right? And sound came out of the amp. And if you don't mind, I'll give a little sample right now because I have my pedal down here.
Oh, let's do it.
Yes, nothing fancy, but it sounded. Now I didn't know my blues scale back then, but that was the sound. It was delay and distortion. His two pedals. Now I told you about my cliche sparkly moment of destiny with Robert before. This was the second time that had happened. Sitting on the floor, And I heard that coming out of the amp. And I was like, I have no idea what that means or what I'm going to do. But that was it. That sound was it. It just spoke to me for some reason. I just found it so exotic and fascinating and just like new world of possibility that didn't have like baggage with it. There was no preconceived, this is the way to do it. There was no tradition really like there is in classical silver flute tradition. So I think I just felt free. I wasn't worried about making mistakes or hurting someone's feelings about my Baroque interpretation or my articulation or my slurs, whatever it was. I just felt free. And that was what I had been seeking. And I just didn't know it. And that was the beginning of the end for me. I kind of never looked back from that moment. But yeah, I didn't know anything about composing, arranging, improvising, or the effects themselves. I guess that was 13 years ago now, and that has been my primary area of research. Sounds so official when I say that word. I think of it as just playing around. No pressure, no strings. And that's how I work best, is in that atmosphere of that I'm just playing around. There's so much left to do with this, and honestly, I just feel like I've gotten it to a place where I can make a consistent and professional sounding sound with it when I travel, so that it's reliable, there's no feedback, I can set it up efficiently. Even just plugging the cables in is a whole master class. So it's like learning, it's like the flute, think of all the time you put into the flute or whatever instrument. It's just another instrument. But combining it with the flute is a new art form, or at least in its early days, of exploring really what the true potential of that is. So that's what makes it so exciting for me.
I'd like to get back into talking about your composing. You mentioned, and I have felt this way about your works as well. They seem deeply personal to you. I had a student who worked on your Moonlight Sonata for one of her grad recitals a couple of years ago. And I thought, yeah, I mean, you didn't need to tell me that you bought this from Melissa Keeling, And so it doesn't always feel this way. I suppose Robert Dick feels this way, but there are a lot of flutist composers out there who really seem like they are kind of composer forward, and then they're clearly very competent flutists who can do their works as well. And you can tell because they craft such lovely compositions for us that are really playable. But your compositions definitely feel like they are vehicles for you to perform. And yet they are also available for sale. What's that balance like for you? I mean, are you hoping that many people play your compositions? Or are you just making them available in case someone's interested? Is it weird when you hear other people's interpretations because they're so deeply yours?
Thanks to your student for playing Moonlight Sonata. That really means a lot to me. And that's a really interesting question to me too. And for the first, I don't know how many years, 7 or 8 years that I was writing music, I didn't feel like I was worthy of title of composer. And that word itself just felt so heavy, like I didn't deserve it, or maybe it would make me feel like there's some kind of standard that I needed to live up to. So I just wanted to feel free. So to avoid that label for a long time just helped me feel like I was just playing around, like I say. You're right. And I'm very honored by your comment there that you could tell that it was one of my pieces when you hear it. That's a humongous compliment to me. Do I write them with the hopes that other people play them? I hope so. I mean, I take the time to write some of them down for that very reason, that I hope some other person might hear it and be like, hey, well, that sounds fun. Let's give that a go. Or hopefully, even better, to maybe use that as a vehicle for them to explore their own style or maybe their own compositions. A lot of my pieces, not Moonlight Sonata, but many of the others, have improvisation in them. And I love hearing people play them. What I really encourage anyone that's playing my music is to do your own thing with it. Some composers don't feel that way.
Right.
And I've played for them. And I can't be someone else. I can't be Robert. I can't be Rhonda Larson. I can't be anyone else. As much as I would love to play like both of them and many others. And if I try it it's a second-rate version of them at best, at very best. And if someone wants to hire or hear that, they should hire Robert for that, not me. I'm a just imitator at best. So anyone playing my music, I hope that they would not do it like me, actually, but to do their own interpretation of it. It's really just like well, here's a platform, and I hope you do something cool with it. And what I always love is to hear how differently people interpret my music. It's kind of like what Robert said to me in one of my lessons. It's like, well, that's not how I would play it, but I love that you played it your way. You can only be yourself. There's a lot of gray area in a lot of my compositions, or even just wording like, try a delay pedal. And many people write to me and say, will you give me your delay settings? And it's like, oh, sure, I will, but you should play around with your delay pedal and find a setting that works for you. Your setup's different than mine. The way you play is different than mine. The way I play, the way that you might want this piece to go might be different than mine. And that's beautiful. I hope others play. But, I honestly don't write music in the composer forward way, as you put that so aptly. I do make it available. At some point I was like, well, hey, people are asking me for the sheets. I guess I could write it down. It's extremely time consuming. It's a huge commitment, and especially to do it right. I self-publish everything under my LLC. I get them printed myself. I engrave them myself. I package everything myself. I take a lot of pride in that, and I enjoy that. So in a way, I'm just one person. I'm not like a publishing house here.
Sure.
I sort of feel like it sometimes. It's more of a invitation to the table rather than a you must do it this way kind of approach, which I hope is liberating for others who might be interested to play it.
I noticed in your bio that you are also on the board of Asbury Park African American Music Project. Can you tell us about it?
So I lived in Asbury Park, New Jersey for many years. It's a wonderful little musical town on the Jersey Shore. And when I was living there, I happened to see a job posting for a researcher. And I was like, well, hey, I'm curious. You might, and others might know Asbury Park as a town where Bruce Springsteen made it big. And that's absolutely true. There's a lot of rock and roll in that town. But what I didn't know, and what most people don't know, is that in the 60s, 50s, and 60s, there was an incredible jazz scene on the west side of town. The town's very small, just a few square miles. And there was one, and still is, a street called Springwood Avenue. And back in the 60s, along Springwood Avenue, there were dozens of jazz clubs. Unfortunately, there was quite a bit of unrest in the early 70s, and many of these buildings that were once music venues were destroyed or changed into other things over time. There is still one standing music venue on that street. There is no music that happens there now, but the building's there. And my work with, it's AP AMP for short, because that's quite a mouthful, Asbury Park African American Music Project, has been to uncover this beautiful jazz history. You had people like Duke Ellington, Count Basie, you name it, like the big jazz greats of the 40s and surrounding decades that would go through the street and just play gigs like no big deal. Local musicians that got their start there. And now there's nothing there. No music there. I just am amazed by that beautiful history and the fact that it has kind of disappeared from the story of Asbury Park. There's a lot to it. I could talk for a really long time about AP AMP, but it's firsthand research of like going to the library and looking at the old street layouts of like where were these places? Where were they? No one even knows who played there. We've interviewed lots of musicians, many of them in their 80s and 90s now, that can firsthand remember what it was like. And honestly, that's the best evidence or story of what was going on in this beautiful scene. There are very few photographs. We're trying to find audio and video, but it just wasn't made. And if it was, it wasn't saved. So I'm really passionate about preserving that legacy, celebrating it. We're trying to rehab that one building that's still there. It's called the Turf Club. We've had some press about our rehab efforts of that. And actually, someone you might know named Phil Unger, Flute Center of New York, is also on the board as he's a resident of Asbury Park. A fun flute fact.
You can apply this to any aspect of your work that you wish. I mean, as Elizabeth described in your introduction, you are also currently teaching at the college level in Kentucky, on top of your performing and composing and staying in touch with AP Amp. Thanks for that. What's the biggest challenge you're facing in your work right now, do you think?
I think maybe a similar one that many of us face, which is time and balance. I have so many inspirations and things that I want to do, and time is finite, unfortunately, and our life energy is finite. And finding ways to hone in on what is the most important, or to prioritize, like, of all these great ideas that I'd like to do or accomplish, or pieces I'd like to play or write. When you make a choice to do something, you're also making a choice to not do other things. Having the discipline of balancing all of this, like you say, the teaching, the nonprofit work that I do, the playing, I teach private lessons, of course. I package all the honey harp music materials. I'm an orchestra librarian as well. I love it all, and that's the thing that keeps me like motivated to do it all. Sometimes it's the saying no. That's a difficult thing for me. So I'm getting better at that. I'm always trying to listen to the voice inside of, well, that sounds fun. Strangely, I guess that's going to be my theme for this. What makes me fired up? Because that's going to prevent me from getting burned out or feeling that like, what's the point of this? I don't feel that way about any of my work because it all has a lot of meaning to me. There's only so many hours in the day, and I have a family. I'm married. I want to see my mom. I want to, pet my cat. Like, there's other things in life too than work and music.
It reminds me of the buckets of time discussion, Elizabeth, that we had with Megan Enan not terribly long ago.
I listened to that in the car the other day.
Yeah. That's a great thing to bring up. Melissa, are there any other art forms or intellectual pursuits that also inspire you in your work?
I would say probably the primary one, which might not be a secret at this point in the interview, is rock and roll music. I love rock and roll. And admittedly, I don't listen to a ton of flute music. I listen to as much of my friends' music and my students' music that I can. But I'd say that that's one of my biggest influences on my playing is rock and roll music. And especially like improvised rock and roll music. That's what makes me very interested, is exploring an improvisational approach that's different than what I might hear in academia or jazz or avant-garde flute music, which has its place. Nothing, like, I'm not throwing shade on anyone here. I guess just more broadly, it's just nature in general. And that is such an old answer that many people give, but it's very true for me. And I learned that about myself when I was living in New York. I think it was about a year in, and I felt like something, like I had like a sickness in my heart. And it wasn't homesickness, although I missed my family. And finally I realized that you took a country girl and put her in a concrete jungle. And there was no trees. There's no grass. And I just realized how important that was for my like just well-being, having some kind of interaction with nature, animals, sitting in grass. It just makes me really happy and feel grounded and recharged. For me, I find myself can easily fall into like a burnout mode because of the amount of work that I do, and I'm sure we all do. So that's my antidote for that is rock and roll music and nature.
What's currently on your workbench?
I love that term for it, by the way. Well, I just finished recording a CD about a month ago. Hypersonic is done, and that is about 5 years or so worth of creative work or the good stuff that made the cut, stuff I'm most proud of for the past 5 years or so. And what I find myself when I put out something or finish a project is I need space and to allow myself that space. Because if I don't, I'll go into burnout mode. I'm not a robot. And there's these natural cycles for me, and I'm sure many other creative people. It ebbs and flows. Sometimes the flow is on, but other times it's just not. There's a bit of that going on right now where I just have like a blank slate and it's like a reset and it's a beautiful thing. And I can't like rush that. And it's hard to not want to be like, okay, well, on to the next thing. It just needs its cycle. The cycle will play. But, of course I'm doing things. Let's see. I have the 100 greatest guitar solos of all time that I've been playing. So that's been a fun book. When I was at NFA, I heard a Mike Mower piece from his book called Doing Time. I don't know if you know this book. This is fabulous. This is one of my favorite things I heard at NFA. They're kind of like etudes, but they're fun. And it has like a backtrack that's like rock, pop, jazzy. Enjoying playing around with that. I'm working on putting together like a rock band instrumentation, but of course with flute playing, trying to put some charts together for that group and having some rehearsals with them. So that's been really exciting and interesting to go more into that rock direction. As you can tell, that's one of my loves. To not put that on the shelf as a part I need to hide about myself, like I learned in my New York days, but to be proud of that and to embrace that and to feel that as a direction that maybe I should explore that more. So I don't know. We'll see where that goes.
Kind of in that vein, one of the questions we've been asking folks this season is if a dream project or collaboration could fall into your lap tomorrow, what would that project be, or who would be calling you?
Oh my gosh. Well, I have so many, so it's like difficult to try to identify any single person for lack of not calling out the others. But yeah, so I feel like I kind of did answer that right then with that last question, which a dream of mine has been to be a flutist in a rock band. I don't think that's been done powerfully since Jethro Tull, and that's been 50 years ago. And I think it could stand up. I think the flute can handle it. It's time. It's just kind of time historically.
Our favorite final question. What are 3 pieces of music you're listening to right now?
Man, okay. So I feel like I've said a few of these already, but I listen to the music that my students are making. That's really important to me. And all of my students, that relationship is extremely important and sacred to me. And I take that very seriously. So if a student is writing music or even makes a recording, I'm absolutely listening to that. That wasn't my own personal experience as a student, so I'm trying to break some of those cycles. A lot of people just want to be seen and heard, right? I'm just one. However, I always take the time to listen to that. And, my colleagues, my friends on social media, anyone that's making something or making their videos or recordings again like that, I'm all about that. Flute-wise, I don't have a lot on my list besides Mike's book that I just mentioned. What am I listening to right now is a Grateful Dead tune called Help on the Way, Slipknot, Franklin's Tower. There's a composed middle section that I'm learning right now. And the guitar solo from Pink Floyd's Comfortably Numb is another one I'm studying right now. Probably a much different answer than you might expect from a flute player.
Well, Melissa, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me and talking to me about all this. I really appreciate both of you.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Music Crush. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also support the podcast, read show notes, and learn more about FNMC by visiting www.flutenewmusicconsortium.com.